So good afternoon, everybody. This is the May meeting of Progressive Legacy. This afternoon, we're joined by Maryland State Delegate Lorig Charkoudian, our delegates in District 20. She's a very accomplished professional in her own right. She's also a very successful legislator. Just looking at her bio, I noticed that she was born in Boston, and
Wow.
has a PhD in economics from Johns Hopkins. So I am very impressed with that, having started a PhD program at Johns Hopkins and did not complete it. Lorig was first elected in 2018. Yes, or second term?
No, first term. Yep.
In 2018, and will be running for re-election in 2022. She has a remarkable record of accomplishment, and she's here with us today to talk about the 2021 General Assembly session, and we could not have a better guest. So without further ado, let me present to you our delegate, my delegate, Lorig Charkoudian from District 20. Welcome, Lorig.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Alan, and thank you all for being here. It's really an honor to join you. And just let me know real quick, are folks from District 20, Montgomery County, the entire state? I don't actually have a sense of what the audience is pulled from, just because that would help me a little bit in placing.
Well, why don't we introduce ourselves?
That would be great.
We'll go according to my screen. Just say who you are and where you live. We'll start with the Carters.
Craig and Gail Carter, Silver Spring.
Okay, Rosie.
Rosie Ingman, Leisure World, District 19.
Dr. Robinson.
Sandy Robinson, Leisure World, District 19.
Who's over there? iPad.
Oh, a Keko Lieutenant and David Lavenshaw. We are in all me.
Hank.
Yes, Henrik Ursula, Wheaton, Silver Spring.
Betsy.
Betsy, the African Queen, Silver Spring, District 18.
And she means it.
And then Barbara, are you still there?
I am, but I'm only seeing you as a tiny little postage stamp, but I don't know how to get out of it. Anyway, Barbara Studwell, Leisure World, District 19.
Okay, I think that's it for the time being. Hopefully other people will join us. Please, Lorig.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And I hope that very soon we'll be meeting in person, so we won't just look like postage stamps to each other, big or small. We're getting close. We are getting close, and actually vaccine distribution and management of that process has been one of my focus areas. But I'm going to kind of back up. If folks want to talk about vaccines, we can towards the end. But what I will do is I'll tell you a little bit about the session, a couple of kind of big priority issues for the entire House, Democratic caucus, and then I'll talk about some of the specific areas that I work on, which are food systems, some economic justice issues, and climate justice. So I serve, as Alan said, I've been in the General Assembly for 3 years now. It has been a most unusual 2 of those 3 years. There is no playbook. And so we're all sort of in the space of how do we take care of people, both in the immediate moment and then going forward. And then also how do we learn from injustices that we've seen, structural injustices that we have seen for years and years and years, and that now are those injustices are so much more blatant under COVID, with the economic strain, with the disparities in who's gotten sick and who's died from COVID, racial disparities, income disparities. And so how do we both respond to that in the immediate moment, but also harness that moment for a longer term social justice change? And so that's kind of the context within which I look at what it is our job to do. So I want to start by highlighting a couple things that we did very early on. And so you may have heard that this was a very unusual session. Normally, how many folks have been to Annapolis? Just like wave if you've been to Annapolis before to like lobby or. So normally it's like a madhouse circus, sort of a place, and you have people kind of nonstop coming and going and grabbing you in the hallway. And You know, both sort of the good and the bad of that, right? You have kind of nonstop lobbying, but you also have grassroots social justice movements who are able to be really part of the process and holding legislators accountable. So this year, of course, it was all virtual. So all of our committee hearings were virtual. Our committee voting was virtual. The public was essentially not able to participate in person at all. They could testify virtually. And then we were on the floor of the General Assembly, more so towards the second half after folks had been vaccinated, to take our votes. Those had to be done in person. But for the most part, it was just a very unusual, different kind of a session, and somewhat limiting in both grassroots social justice groups' ability to participate, you know, like in rallies and that kind of thing. But also limiting, I found, in, you know, where we would want to, you know, in some ways we were very efficient because we weren't going to like dinners, but in other ways, you know, the informal way that you want to work through some of the more complicated policies in person, in passing, grab somebody, hey, can I count on your vote? What are your concerns? I heard you say this. It all had to be very formalized. And I think, you know, I hope that in the broader lessons that we learn about transparency and being able to have everything available online, I hope we continue with that, you know, really the accessibility. But I do hope that we're able to really find the right balance, because the interpersonal nature of connections and policymaking and collaboration, I think, are really crucial. So that was sort of just how, just a very different sort of, and also it's very hard to have a mask on and stand up with a microphone and speak on the House floor. Just logistically, it's hard to give a speech with a mask on. So all necessary, but challenging. So, but with that backdrop, I think we accomplished an extraordinary number of things, and there's a lot that's left undone that we'll come back to next year. So I want to start with talking about the COVID relief package, because I think that was a really important for a number of reasons. One is just in general that the House and Senate both prioritized early on putting together a relief package that would include income tax credits back using the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit, getting credits back to the lowest income Maryland taxpayers. It included money for utility assistance and food assistance and a number of different emergency responses that you're probably aware of, each of the counties kind of managing. But the most important thing that happened in my mind in terms of larger structural justice in that bill is we actually did it in a separate bill, and it took quite a bit of advocacy to do this, but we put into place an ability for people who file their taxes with an ITIN number instead of a Social Security number to get this tax rebate. And so ITIN is the individualized tax identification number. So people who don't have a Social Security number, many of whom are undocumented, pay their taxes. And what happened, as you probably know, in this pandemic, is that almost all of the aid that was available to people who were here with documentation. And so unemployment and emergency assistance. And so undocumented folks in our communities suffered the most, both in terms of disparities of who got COVID, who died from COVID, but also economically, they received almost none of the aid that was available. So when the General Assembly moved to allow ITIN filers to receive the Earned Income Tax Credit that was part of this aid package, it was the first in the country. And in doing so, we not only set that up for this particular aid package, but for the next several years, and it created a structure that we expect we will make permanent at some point that ensures, again, I think you all are probably aware, but undocumented folks consistently pay taxes, pay into the system, and are consistently excluded from any of the supports that those taxes provide for other folks. And so, it's it was important for this year, for this emergency aid, but I think it's really important in terms of what it says about what we're preparing to do long-term for greater inclusion. We passed a few other bills, and I'm actually working right now on the regulatory level, looking at ways that inadvertently our utility assistance, for example, excludes people without Social Security numbers. It really sort of has opened up this conversation of where do we inadvertently have an intention to be helping everybody, but really because of the structures we have in place or the ID requirements or whatever they might be, someone doesn't have a social, they're paying into the system, but they're not getting the benefits, they're not getting the help that they need. So, so I think that's a really important piece. I'll stop there for a quick second to see if I'm going to talk about some of the other sort of emergency COVID related things, but let me just see if folks have either questions or comments on any of that.
I've got a question. Is Maryland kind of unique in trying to extend benefits to undocumented people? Are we the exception? I'm sure we're an exception rather than the rule.
It's my understanding that this specific approach of earned income tax credits extended to people filing with ITIN, that we're the first state in the country. There's other states that, for example, had some direct payments, like I think California back when unemployment was where there was a focus on unemployment or recognition that people who didn't have Social Security numbers couldn't get unemployment. California had some direct payments to people who were undocumented. But in terms of this, just a handful of states did that. In terms of this particular model of earned income tax credit, I think we're the first in the country.
So my impression is that Maryland leads in a lot of areas, but there's some areas it's not a leader, but it looks like in terms of the police accountability issues, in terms of this issue, some of the environmental issues, Maryland is a leader. So it's an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, it's a mix. It's definitely a mix. So I'll get to policing in just a second. I do want to also mention that the unemployment insurance was the other area that I personally spent a lot of time on, and I had a really significant bill on. If folks may have recalled over the course of the last year, one disaster after another in the Department of Labor and their unemployment insurance system. And really what it comes down to is that you have a Republican governor whose primary strategy is to gut public agencies. I mean, he has not filled positions. There's like 25, 30% vacancy rates in a lot of agencies. He hasn't invested in training. He hasn't invested in technology. And so when you do that, even if you want the system to work in a crisis, it just can't. You have to invest in government for it to work when you need it to work. And so that's what happened. And it left thousands of Marylanders at their most desperate, waiting, in systems that were crashing, starting their unemployments, then their unemployment payments just dried up. They couldn't reach anybody by phone. Our offices became experts just so they could try to help people through it. And so, really what my bill tried to do was to say, there were parts of my bill that I wanted to name, the answer the damn phone legislation, doing customer service. And it's ridiculous that you have to legislate sort of good customer service, but that's a piece of what we have to do right now. There's other pieces that were more structural changes, putting into place longer appeals processes, more requirements on the agency to provide information for the reasons for denial, because a lot of times people had the ability to appeal, but they couldn't understand the reasons they were denied because the state doesn't require that you put that information in there. Very technical, but really important in terms of making the system work for struggling Marylanders. The other really important thing, and this is a first, Maryland's the first on this one, Alan, so you can add this to the list, is making an automatic connection between unemployment insurance and health insurance connection. So what happens is that when people have been insured through their employer, lose their job, are feeling desperate, or just trying to figure all the pieces out, most people don't know that Maryland Health Benefits Exchange is there and may have subsidized plans that they could access for themselves and their family. And what we found was that while 6% of Marylanders are uninsured, 26% of unemployed Marylanders are uninsured. And so what my bill does is it sets up an automatic connection when people originally file, and then with each weekly filing, it says, do we have your permission to share your information with the Health Benefits Exchange so they can tell you what you might be eligible for? And by just making it an opt-in that's simple like that, we expect that, like other opt-in programs, like what we did with taxes a few years ago, where you can just check a box on your taxes and say, yeah, I'd like to know about affordable insurance. And that's gone a long way to increase insurance rates in the state. So the hope is that that makes it easy and that increases the amongst those who are, especially amongst those who are unemployed. So and we're the first, and now sort of all these health care advocates are sort of taking that model and trying to get other states to replicate it, because it goes well beyond just the COVID issues. So so that was exciting. There were a couple other big unemployment insurance. The other sort of directly related to COVID piece of legislation that we passed is the Essential Workers Protection Act. And this bill puts into place some protections for essential workers that were really missing, and requires the Maryland Occupational Safety and Health Agency to implement an emergency standard. The bill came in much more comprehensive, and I was very hopeful that we would really move the needle on worker protection even more. It got gutted quite a bit. So really important things did pass, but quite a bit less than, there's still a lot of work that we need to continue doing on worker protection, our most vulnerable workers. I think that's it that I wanted to highlight as it relates to the sort of COVID related stuff. So I'll stop there again, see if there's questions, and then I'll move on to policing. Okay. So I think everyone's aware of, the police issues that we were dealing this year. One really interesting thing, and I think as progressives is probably your sense as well. I mean, many of us have been advocating for massive criminal justice and police reform for years and years and years, and responding to systems that have been built on and put into place over 400 years in this country. But this year, because of the sort of racial justice movement that was reinvigorated last summer with a combination of the George Floyd situation and COVID, and a recognition of systemic racism in ways that we haven't seen, the recognition that we haven't seen, I think, across the board in many, many years. And so it really finally put the pressure on everybody to say, we've got to move on a lot of these issues that have been in front of the General Assembly for many years. We also have, for the first time in the history of Maryland, the first African-American woman, first African-American and the first woman, yes, it's very exciting. It's historic, Speaker of the House. And I think that combination of where we are in history, this moment, and her extraordinary leadership, her vision, her courage, her commitment to get this right this year, is what got us what we got. And I will say that, it's hard because, again, when you're progressive, I find myself always looking at the things we didn't get done. And so it is really important to honor and acknowledge what we did do. My father, who's still in Boston, called and he was like, did you see the New York Times piece? And I hadn't seen this one, highlighting Maryland is really right now having the strongest state. I don't know, folks, on this, if you guys saw it, but it's the strongest nationally, the strongest statewide policies in terms of police reform. So locally, you might have cities that do a better job, but in terms of state policy, and really we moved the needle on a number of things. Anton's Law, which is related to the public information about police officers and the complaints against them. We moved the needle on repealing the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, replacing it with a structure that is really focused on civilian participation and civilian oversight. It's a little bit complex. There's a lot of different levels of it, but it is grounded in a civilian oversight concept. We moved the needle on use of force with some of the strongest use of force language, requiring body cams. What are some of the other ones? I'm trying to remember now. We've got, we moved a little bit on pensions, although I think there's still work that we need to do around qualified immunity. We did not move as far as I had hoped we would on school resource officers. And so really we need to, that's something that the minor change that was made this year was remove, right? In the past, we've had a requirement that a particular grant program be used for schools to put into place police officers in the schools. And we changed that so that now they are able to use that same grant for mental health restorative approaches in the schools or school resource officers. But there's more work to do, I would say, in that area. So it's a couple other things that we still sort of remain as it relates to police reform, but overall we made some really significant progress and moved some things this year that I think, no-knock warrants was the other piece. So limiting warrants, limiting no-knock warrants significantly. The bills are multifaceted. So a lot of really good stuff. I'll stop for a second, see if folks have questions or comments about any of that before I move on.
Anybody have questions so far?
I'll mention education because there's two things I want to highlight on education, and then I'm going to move on to climate and some of the things I've been working on. So on education, we overrode the governor's veto on the Blueprint for Maryland's Future, which was a major success last year in terms of investment in education, massive investment in education, but again, an investment that's grounded in looking at equity and closing the opportunity gap, the racial opportunity gap, and the gap that we see in terms of kids with disabilities and lower income kids. So we overrode the veto, and then we added basically to the blueprint, we called it Blueprint 2.0, to address some of the disparities that were made worse by having over a year now of exclusively online education. The other really important thing that we did is that we put into place historic funding for HBCUs. And over many, many years, there's been inequities in the way HBCUs have been funded compared to other public institutions in the state. And there's been a lawsuit and attempts to negotiate within that lawsuit, and it's been an ongoing issue. And this year, the General Assembly finally passed it's a $577 million to address the issues that were related by that. So leveling the playing field. So it doesn't fix historic wrongs, but it gets it right going forward, and that's an important start. So moving on to some of the climate issues, and I'll just tell you a little bit about this. I do work a lot on climate issues myself, and what I try to do issues within the climate world is have two really important lenses that I think we need in front of us as we're doing the climate work. One is the equity lens, and I've been talking about that on these other issues, but really recognizing that climate change has disproportionately affected communities of color and low-income communities, and that in fact, the entire structure of climate change, the fossil fuel industry, has depended on essentially having sacrifice zones, like zones that, and that's starting from indigenous lands for where we have extracted the fossil fuels, to indigenous communities of color where we have transmitted the fossil fuels, to primarily communities of color where we have burned the fossil fuels, and the health impacts that have come with that, of course, have been, we saw it in COVID and everything else in terms of pre-existing conditions and social determinants of health. So what that means is, as we build our response to it, not only do we need to sort of fix those things, but we need to make sure that the communities that have been disproportionately affected sort of are getting more of the benefit of the clean energy, more of the benefit of the trees we're planting, more of the benefit of whatever it is that we're putting into place to resolve climate change. And so, for example, there's with building the Purple Line, one of the things that happened, this is a relatively narrow thing, but it gives an example of how I try to think about this. Building the Purple Line, one of the things that happens is that they cut down all the trees along through Long Branch, Wayne Avenue, all through in the Silver Spring areas that are they're already heat islands. They're already areas that are hard to walk through. They're transit dependent communities. A lot of them, they're even more unpleasant to walk through. And we required trees to be replanted, but all those trees got replanted 4 times the number of trees, whatever it was, which is important, but replanted 5 miles away from here. And so one of my bills is that is to require the State Department of Transportation, with the Purple Line and other urban transportation projects, to find ways to put the trees back in the communities from which they were taken. And it takes a little more work because there's not necessarily space in the state's right of way. So the bill requires that they work with private landowners, the county, the state, the city, to find a way to put the trees back into those communities. And it's kind of silly that it would take legislation to do that, but it does. And so now that's sort of in place as it relates to tree replacement. So some of the other bills that I do a lot of work on energy bills. So I had a bill that is geothermal renewable energy credits bill to incentivize more geothermal. So folks aren't familiar with geothermal. It's basically takes the heat and the cool from the ground, because below the earth, just six feet below, it's a constant 55 to 60 degrees temperature. And we can actually use that as both a heat sink and a cold sink in the winter or the summer, and heat our homes and our buildings with that. And it's important to decarbonize, it's important for decarbonizing our buildings, but it's also really important because from a health perspective, burning any fossil fuel in our home, even natural gas, which has been touted as clean, is bad. It creates problematic indoor air quality, and especially in poorer buildings that are in sort of poorer, older buildings that are in poor upkeep. Burning fossil fuels in those buildings is even worse for indoor air quality, asthma, and so on and so forth. So, so we put together this bill, which is, renewable energy credits carve out for geothermal. But a couple of things that were really important in this. One was that 25% of all the recs that go in the state have to go towards low-income communities. So that means either multifamily housing, single family, schools, someplace where you're more likely to have buildings that are in maybe in more disrepair, where this benefit both of the lower cost of energy, but also of the cleaner air that comes with this is going to be especially important. So that was one piece of it. But the second piece that was really important is that we brought the unions to the table, and we made sure that we were working with the labor unions, the industry, civil rights groups, environmental justice groups in crafting the legislation. Because if you're following national issues, of course, you know that pipelines, Biden, in very effectively saying we're going to shut down the pipelines, is getting pushback from unions who are saying this is some of the best work we get, right? And so we do need to shut down those pipelines, and we need to do it as quickly as possible, but we also need to find work for folks who, have gotten good wages and good health care and, everything else, building pipelines. And so what's nice about geothermal, actually, and this is why I started with this one, because I'm hoping to expand these concepts to other clean energy. But geothermal is actually the same skill set as pipeline building, right? So the steam fitters, LIUNA, laborers, it's the same work. And so so as we grow this new industry, we create, not just we need to retrain folks, because we don't, we really just need to shift that skill set to a new industry. And so really growing the geothermal industry in the state with the unions at the table from the very beginning. So we're not negotiating later. And we built the labor standards into the legislation. And so I highlight this because I think as we look at the challenges nationally that we have and how are we going to make this transition, it's really important to me that every single piece of clean energy legislation is looking at equity, inclusion, repairing the harm, and looking at how do we make sure the jobs that get created are as good, if not better, wage-wise, benefit-wise, as the jobs that we're getting rid of. Couple other bills along those same lines. I passed a bill that requires the Public Service Commission to consider climate and labor in all of their decisions. So if you can imagine the agency that's responsible for overseeing our energy system and all the companies in our energy system, distribution as well as generation, is not required to, well, now they are, well, not just yet, starts October 1, but has not been required to consider climate in their decision-making. And so that was a really important piece of it. But then at the same time, while we were looking at that, I said, we're also going to put labor in there because, again, if we're not keeping labor front and center in this new clean energy world that we're creating, we're going to have a whole host of other problems. And we're going to continue to have the income disparities and the income gap and the wealth gap grow in this country. So that's a public service consideration of climate and labor. And then finally, I want to mention that we passed the Community Choice Energy Bill, which is really important for Montgomery County. Montgomery County is interested in reaching zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2035, which is a more it's a more aggressive goal than the state has. And so the only way for the county to reach that, there's a bunch of things the county has to do, but one thing they have to be able to do is essentially purchase energy on behalf of all of the residents to get clean energy for everybody as an opt-out. And so what we've seen in other states is community choice energy has resulted in lower prices and more clean energy. And so naturally the utilities and the retail suppliers, you know, the reason that works is because you're sort of cutting at this gap of profit, because now you have the county being the one negotiating and on behalf of everyone. So it was a huge fight, 3 years of effort. And we finally got that through. So Montgomery County now has the ability to pilot that. And over the next few years, you'll probably be hearing more about that. And the last of my climate bills that I just want to highlight is an organic waste ban, which requires that people who are generators of large amounts of organic waste, food waste, are required to either donate it, compost it, or recycle it in some way. They can't send it to landfill or an incinerator if there's a compost facility within 30 miles of where they operate. And that's really important. In other states, what it's done is it's increased food rescue, and it's also increased the compost infrastructure. And so then once you use this model to increase the compost infrastructure, then it becomes less expensive to do residential compost, curbside pickup, and the smaller scale compost. And that's really what we hope will happen over the next few years. You might have heard that the bill Climate Solutions Now Act, would anyone work on that bill? A couple folks were working on that. It was a big bill that was a number of groups, the League of Conservation Voters, Chesapeake Climate Action Network had promoted that as their primary. It's a really comprehensive bill. It raised the standards of the state, the greenhouse gas reduction goals to 60% by 2030. It did a number of other things in terms of building standards and planting trees. And unfortunately, that bill did not pass. It kind of got caught in a disagreement between the Senate and the House in the final hours, and it did not make it through. And one other bill that did pass, that I did want to mention, is the Transit Safety and Investment Act, which is a bill that requires a great deal of investment into transit, addressing years and years of, again, the Hogan administration not investing in transit. And what we found is that what's really important about this bill is that when we're looking at climate change, transportation, of course, is the number one contributor. Electricity is the second to climate change. And investing in transit is the best way to ensure equity in responding to that challenge. And so it's really important that we get the transit right, that we clean up our transit system, but that we also make it efficient and effective so people who need to use it can, but also people who have a choice will choose to use it, and then thus getting more cars off the road. So those are a couple really important. There's some other smaller isn't the right word, but there are other climate pieces of legislation that passed, but those are the ones that I would highlight. Let me stop. I have other bills I want to talk about, but let me stop there and see if there's climate related questions that folks have.
I have one. First, I would like to know the status of the offshore wind farms.
That's a great question. So you may know that in the 2010 or 2012, Maryland passed the first round one offshore wind requirements, 400 megawatts. And so those two, that was the Public Service Commission put it out for bid. There were two winners, US Wind and Ørsted. And so they have their areas offshore and they're supposed to be developing. Ocean City, and then the Hogan administration pandering to Ocean City, has brought every delay possible, which were reinforced and supported by the Trump administration. And so while they are technically moving forward with this very first offshore wind installment, this 400 megawatts between the two of them, 360 megawatts, They really have been slow walked in a way that is just unconscionable as far as I'm
Mhm.
concerned for what offshore wind sort of offers
That's
to the climate change. Meanwhile, in 2019, the General Assembly passed legislation for another round 2 of offshore wind for 1,200 megawatts. So that process has started with the Public Service Commission, and the PSC opened the bidding last year, and it's moving forward as it would be expected. It's kind of a technical process where they open the bidding. It's open for like 4 months. They get a bid. Once they get that first bid, they're about to give it. Then they have to share that bid with anyone else who's interested, who's allowed to match that bid. So it's kind of, it takes a little bit of time. I expect, based on my understanding of that process, that in the next like 2 or 3 months, we'll know about that first bid, how much it's for, if it's for the entire 1,200 or if it's for some portion of that. And then PSC has the option of doing round 2 and round 3. The problem is the state has done such, and by the state, I mean the governor and his administration, done such an effective job of communicating to offshore wind that we don't want you here, that I fear that meanwhile, Virginia and New Jersey,
They are.
they're leapfrogging ahead of us.
They are.
7,500 megawatts, I think, in New
Yeah.
Jersey, and something like 9,000 in Virginia or something like that. And so my fear is that we have lost, certainly momentum. We've definitely lost momentum, but I'm worried that we've also lost this opportunity we had to be in being first, the ability to then also be sort of the headquarters in the mid-Atlantic, which just coming back to what I was saying about union jobs, offshore wind is the only other renewable other than now geothermal that would have been union jobs that we were building, that unions were at the table from the beginning in those jobs. In addition to the fact that offshore wind is just really important, it has a high capacity factor, it blows when the sun doesn't shine. Like it's important for a million reasons, but that's another one. And so I feel really disheartened about that. I'm hoping we still move forward with the now 1,600 that we can get. But I don't know what it's going to mean if the companies just aren't interested in working with Maryland.
And the next thing I want to know, are they building in anywhere in the state of Maryland a compost factory where you can sell the compost to the farmers? And that you could sell it in Virginia and Pennsylvania. This is what they have in California. It's a money maker. It's a money maker.
Thank you, Rosie. I would like to add to that too, that I would like to be able to have a green bucket with our trash where we can put the composting and it would go somewhere where people can use it.
So the answer to
We need
both
a factory.
the answer is sort of. So right now in Maryland, we do have compost facilities. And the biggest one is in Prince George's County.
No.
And you can buy leaf grow in like Home Depot. That's the leaf grow is the Prince George's County facilities compost is the product. Montgomery County is looking to develop similar curbside pickup. So that's kind of coming from the county, I think soon. I don't know how soon. The bill that I passed, the goal of it is that as we grow that infrastructure by requiring the big guys to use compost, it'll lower the cost so that you can do more of that bucket in front of your house model, whether that's managed by municipalities or counties or individuals who choose to participate in it. So we're sort of moving in that direction, and the hope is the bill will kind of catapult us forward in that direction.
I also wanted to ask, what can we as citizens can do to promote the wind farms and other like wave motion capture energy, things like that? What can we do?
Invest in Denver.
Vote out Hogan, right?
Definitely get rid of Hogan. Yeah, so I think a couple things. One is if you're not connected to some of the groups that do like action alerts on these things. So for example, the Chesapeake Climate Action Network, I know when Hogan and there were hearings, we actually went, the Public Service Commission had a hearing in Ocean City. So of course it was all the Ocean City folks, the rest of us had to drive there. I got to say, I'm proud of this. It was the first time I've been booed by 1,000 people. So, you know, I was the only, all the local legislators were there, like, kill the project. And I stood up and I was like, it's really important. We need to move it forward. And like this whole crowd starts booing me. But anyways, I'm very proud of that. But CCAN, for example, and League of Conservation Voters, if you're on their mailing lists, you'll get things like action alerts, like, oh, write to the Public Service Commission about this issue, write to the governor about this issue, write to the Maryland Energy Administration. So I can make sure, Alan, if you have the email list for these folks, that you have to send those groups out. But I do think, like, talking to and you've got a nice mix of folks. Montgomery County legislators are pretty good on these bills. Matter of fact, Senator Kramer, just for you District 19 folks, was my cross-file and Public Service Commission requirement that they considered climate and labor. And he fought really hard for community choice energy in the Senate. So you should be proud of that. Thank him for that. But I think that, yeah, continuing to talk to, like, if you show up at all of your legislators' town halls and raise the issue, it makes it more of a priority for them to have to answer that. Same with, you know, the governor's race. I think it's really important to keep it front and center in the governor's race, both offshore wind as well as new emerging technologies like wave, tidal, and others. That storage is the next, is another really big thing we got to get right.
Sandy, you've got a question? You're muted, Sandy.
Yeah. Is there any possibility to partner with other states in terms of climate and energy? I think that would be pretty powerful. For example, I think Delaware is doing quite a bit with wind farms. And is that possible, or is there a movement that could be started where there is a partnership with states that are adjacent to Maryland?
So there is a loose affiliation. It's like the Mid-Atlantic Wind something. I can't remember the name of it. With an idea of coordinating efforts. So yes, I mean, I think that there can be coordinated efforts and that can build on itself. But the bottom line is we need every single state, if we're going to make this energy transition, every state has to maximize its offshore wind development. And so we can't, that's a hard thing to do in a partnership. But I will say there's another kind of partnership. I've been working with the National Conference on Environmental Legislators, which is a national group. And there's things like, and this gets a little bit wonky, but the PJM grid, which is the grid that 13 states are in, and they set rules, and a lot of their rules are very fossil fuel focused. And so trying to work with the 13 states and other legislators to put pressure on them. I got legislators across those states to file with FERC on one of the rules that would have affected our ability to do more clean energy work. So yes, and probably we could do more. So thank you for asking. I mean, there's some possibilities, there's some of that happening, and we probably need to find more ways to do that too.
Okay, thanks.
There were 2 or 3 other issues I just wanted to mention that I worked on that I think are important, and some of it's in the food area. I've done a lot of work on food justice and food systems and equity and access within our food systems. One of the bills that I passed sort of expanded SNAP benefits and really made to make sure that basically what happened was Maryland was leaving money on the table. It's federal money. And with that, because we didn't implement this Heat and Eat program, because states can choose to implement it or not, because we chose not to, we were literally leaving $23 million of SNAP money on the table every single week, right, when people are starving. So the bill that I passed requires that. It also requires that the state look for ways to streamline applications to all of the services, because right now you have to apply here for your utility assistance, and here for your SNAP, and here for your rent benefits, and here for your this, and looking at ways to sort of streamline that for folks. Also on the food side of things, we passed a bill that creates the Maryland Food Resiliency Council. Are folks familiar with the Montgomery County Food Council? Is anyone familiar with the work that they do? They do really good work sort of breaking down the silos of all the various agencies that are involved in the food system. and really looking at ways to go sort of farm to food processing locally to person, looking at food access issues, farmers markets, doubling SNAP benefits at farmers markets, making farmers markets accessible in food deserts, making farmers markets places where people can earn supplemental income, starting small businesses, MoCo made, sort of all of these pieces of the food system. And then this year in COVID, they were a major driver on making food distribution widely available to folks very quickly through grassroots efforts, through churches and synagogues and mosques and grassroots groups. So we took that concept and made it law at the state level. Worked with Montgomery County and a handful of other local jurisdictions have food councils, and they've been so effective. So we put it into place at a state level. I'm really excited about that. The other two bills I wanted to mention, one is a Medical Debt Protection Act. So I think this is an issue that's gotten some press. You're probably aware of hospitals who, use really aggressive debt collection processes, and essentially you have people who become bankrupt, lose their home, lose everything because they got sick. In some cases, it starts with a lawsuit over $150 or a couple $100, and then it expands. By the time, by the time we almost made it through without the allergies getting their in, but they like to make an appearance, whenever I'm speaking to. They're like my friends, sort of. The bill that I passed put in guardrails on how the hospitals could go after debt, especially for low-income folks, but for everybody, because even if you have a relatively comfortable middle-income life, if you get $3,000-$4,000 that you can't pay right away, you could end up with fees and courts and court costs and this and that, and suddenly you owe $26,000 and you lose your house. So the bill I passed, you can't have a lien on a primary residence, can't do wage garnishment for low and moderate income individuals, and a number of other protections just to really make sure that people don't end up in real financial strife because they got sick. And the final bill that I just want to mention is the mobile crisis units bill. So another area I've done a lot of work on is mental health services, and especially the intersection between mental health and the criminalization of mental health. And so over the years, I've done a couple different things on it, but this year, the bill that I have increased funding for and increased sort of the standards for mobile crisis units. And in particular, responding to, people may be aware that in our district in White Oak, a young man named Finhan Berhe was killed by police in early summer. It was about a year ago. And he sort of had a mental health breakdown, and police were called. He had a knife. Police were called. He wasn't threatening anyone directly, and he was shot and killed. And it really, in talking to his family, among other things, I ended up talking to his family and the Ethiopian community about the lack of cultural competency even within the mental health structures that exist, and then a complete failure of a mobile crisis unit to be able to respond to these things. So I put into legislation requirements around language access, cultural competency, those kinds of things for mobile crisis units, and then also increased state funding for that. Obviously, there's lots of different potential entrance ways into the mental health services, and that we have to really increase the prevention side of things, but really looking at that place where a lot of people either are killed by police or their mental health kind of puts them on the path to criminal mass incarceration, and mobile crisis units being key of like, are we going to respond to that crisis with compassion and professional health services as opposed to with force and a criminal justice response. And so it's an area that I feel good about what we did this year. I feel like it's an area we really need to continue working on. And so I'll be working on that going forward. All right, let me stop there. See if there's other.
Lori, there's a question in the chat about I-495 and 270 and developments during the session.
Yeah, I'm gonna blame the Senate. My first House bill next year is gonna be just to get rid of the Senate, because it's where all of our good bills. We do all this work, we send it to the Senate. Yeah, you know, a number of us in the House have worked on these issues over the last several years. And in particular, we have a couple of bills that we've brought. Jared Solomon, you might know, has brought, someone was District 18, number of his bill really to bring more public oversight to the P3 process. And then Mark Corman has had a bill that just is actually it should be a simple bill. It says, you know, MDOT made all of these promises, and it takes all those promises, it just puts it into statute, right? So it's everything they said they were going to do, but we know they've often said they're going to do things and then not done them. We have examples of big projects over the years. And so both of those bills now, they didn't make it out of the Senate last year. We brought them back this year. We passed them out of the House and they didn't make it out of the Senate. I have to be honest, I think that the strategy right now is to delay and delay and delay until Hogan's gone and hope that we get someone who will be willing to derail that project, and that we aren't so far into it that we can't back out or at least radically change, you know, what it is, and certainly the expansion, the actual highway expansion parts of the project. There's a lot of work that we could do both with 270 and 495 that would improve the commute if we can make that investment. So the hope is that we can, you know, delay and then, you know, in the various lawsuits, if folks are following the details of it and the parks and planning and the refusal to give access to the, you know, the parts of Rock Creek Park and all of that kind of creates some hopefulness that at least the 495 part will be able to slow down or completely derail.
Hank, you have a question?
Yeah, I just had one little observation. The situation with Mr. Hogan is he's playing like he's the only game in town. And quite frankly, we had the three people who were to make an agreement on this whole project, and two of them were out of town whenever one of them was here, was on and off. And then Anthony,
Public Works Board.
Yeah, Public Works Board. Then Anthony Brown came in and he said, I'm gonna go directly to the feds. Now, how is that going? Do you know?
Yeah, that's a good question. So he's asking, I think, right, and now we have friends in the administration, right? And so I think he's asking the feds to relook at all of the various permits and permitting and NEPA and all of those things that we've gotten through. And I haven't heard anything specific other than that he's made that request. So I actually don't know. I don't know. I mean, I think that it will take a little bit of time. We probably will know soon if they're willing to open up the re-permitting. And I'm not sure exactly what the technical term is, but I don't know is the short answer. But you know, it's good. Let's leave it all on the table.
We only have a few minutes left. I could listen to Lorig talk about these things for hours upon hours, and I'm sure she could do that. I wanted to ask a question about, we had Vaughn Stewart to us just before the session began, and he had a raft of progressive legislation that we were very interested in. And one of them, I think, was addressing issues of evictions and foreclosures. Happened with that at the end of the day.
Yeah, let me start with the good news, which is that his bill to dignity, not detention, did pass. And that's the bill that forbids states from basically renting out their jail space to ICE. So that passed. That was a really big win for immigration dignity, because that really created incentives for local law enforcement to pick up immigrants for no good reason, just because they were going to make money by having them in the jails. Doesn't address the 783G issue, which still needs to be addressed, but it's still important. There was a whole host of renter protection bills and tenant protection bills. And I would say for the most part, we did not address that issue well. One or two pieces of those bills made it through. I don't know whose bills they were, but sort of an access to counsel bill made it through. But the problem is the other bill that was going to fund having counsel for renters didn't make it through. So you sort of set up a right to counsel, but we don't have a way to fund it. And so it kind of is meaningless at this point, except that it sets us up for next year to get that funding. Vaughn also had a foreclosure protection bill, which I actually fought really hard for. That came to my committee. You know, unfortunately, the bankers have a lot of influence. I don't know the details of all of why we couldn't move it, but we weren't able to move that bill either. So I would say most folks kind of looking at everything we did would say we made really good progress in almost every area, although we didn't go as far as we could have in some, except rental protection is sort of the area that we feel like we really didn't get something substantive done. So we need to come back on that.
And then I have a question for you, which is coming out from left field, but some of the people in this group have been really interested in having something in the county named to honor Nelson Mandela. And we've thought about how we could work that through the county council, but I'm wondering, just as we pick your brain right now, can you think of any low-hanging fruit where we could name a park, a road, a path, a building, something to memorialize Nelson Mandela? The county's got some pretty strict naming rules that want you to focus on people who lived in the county, but most of us believe that Nelson Mandela is worthy of being memorialized, and I wonder if there's anything you could do at the county level to designate a building or a stretch of road or something like that.
Well, first, let me say what a great idea. And then let me say that I saw him when he came to tour the United States right after he was released. I mean, me and like 10,000 of my friends, but in Boston, I had worked on South Africa issues, and it was like the first big thing in my lifetime. I was a good bit younger. First big thing in my lifetime where you like saw the change, like in my, so it's a big deal. So I share the excitement around the possibility of honoring him. I just don't know enough about the county's rules. It may be worth like looking at, are there any buildings or parks or anything that are named after like other civil rights icons who aren't Montgomery County? Was that?
Churchill.
It's not a civil rights icon.
I realize that, but that was named after Churchill, a high school. High school,
yeah. So I think it's worth looking at what are other things that have been named. So you're right. I guess it doesn't have to be looking at one that we like. It could be looking at one that we, don't necessarily like, but looking at ones that we that are named after someone that's not a Montgomery County. Is there something in that process that allowed that to happen? That's the only thought that I have.
Yeah, there's Rosa Parks Elementary, right?
Yep.
Yeah, my suggestion was not that it would come from the county, but that it would come from the state, that the state could name something from a state property or a state asset. Might be able to, they probably have strict naming conventions themselves, but we're exhausting the possibilities at the county level. There might be some opportunities at the state level because we have a state park, and there might be a way to name a parking lot or something, an athletic field for Mandela in a state park somewhere throughout.
We do. That's interesting. Can you do me a favor, Alan, and send me a follow-up email just so I don't lose track of it, and I'll work with Victoria. I'll just see if I can find out at least what the rules are. And then we can see if there's a pathway within that but it'll probably be significant advocacy, which it looks like y'all are ready to do. But let's at least find out what the path is. No pun intended, right? Since pathway fails.
I know there's an interest in renaming Georgia Avenue, Martin Luther King Boulevard. I don't know how they're going to feel about that in Olney, but there's some talk about that. But that's a state road. A lot of state highways, are named after state police officers who have fallen in the line of duty. So there may be some opportunities for,
like a portion of the state highway. That's interesting. Like this portion of Route 410 is such and such. Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay.
We'll throw it out there. So we've
find out what the rules are. Yeah, that's a good place to start. Thank you.
we've come to the end of our hour. We do this periodically, and over the course of the next, as we get into election season, we'll be inviting other people to come and talk to us about their vision for the future for the state and the county and the country. And what they've, some of them have done during the legislative session. So we couldn't be happier to have you as a guest. We learned a lot.
Thank you.
And
Thank you so much. It was very.
Thank you.
we're all fans, and this has been recorded. We'll post this to our Facebook page and direct people to it so they can learn more about the many issues that you talked about. There's lots of issues that we could also talk about the fiscal position of the state after COVID. We could talk about marijuana and sports betting. We could talk about the future of transit, post-pandemic. And I would personally like to hear more about the geothermal, because it's hard to imagine putting a geothermal unit on my property, especially. It sounds like remarkable technology. And then, of course, a lot of us are interested in solar, and we didn't get to talk about that today. But we'd like to thank you on behalf of Progressive Legacy.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. That's
Thank
wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
An honor.
Please come back.
Thank you, Alan, for bringing up Nelson Mandela.
Please come
Thank you,
back.
thank you,
Please
thank
come
you,
back
thank
and-
you, thank
Yeah,
you.
that was good.
Please come back and visit us sometime
Oh,
later.
that'd be wonderful.
I hope so.
Mhm.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this.
Thank
This
you.
was
Thank
great.
you, Lori. She's the best.
Yep.
Yes, she is.
Excellent
Okay,
presentation.
all right, thank you. Thank you, Alan.
Wait, I'm going to